Where is consciousness? Where do you think? Where is the mind? There are verses in the Qur'an that seemingly indicate that it's in the heart. But is this a scientific mistake? The answer to this question might be much more complicated than Now, most people, if you ask them where thinking happens, where is the consciousness, where is your mind, they're going to point to their head. I think today that's something we can all agree on. But this is actually something that is only an assumption. There is actually no evidence that your thinking happens in your brain. Now, some may say, but there are brain waves that have been observed and all of this kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that that is where the thinking is happening. In fact, this is actually a huge problem in philosophy called the hard problem of consciousness, where our biology doesn't seem to account for our mental faculties, our ability to think and contemplate, and us using our mind. So this is actually a much more complicated problem than you would intuitively think. But if you dig deep into the scientific literature as well, you see that there's some serious problems with consciousness from a naturalistic standpoint. It cannot really be explained, and there have been attempts to explain it, but all of these explanations are riddled with problems and assumptions. So this is actually something that we don't know, where thinking or consciousness happens in the brain. But when we look at the Islamic tradition, and we're going to get into the verses on this topic in a bit, we find that scholars have different opinions about this issue actually. So we actually find that An-Nawawi rahimahullah, he mentions that it is the view of the Shafi'iyya, the Shafi'i scholars, the Maliki scholars, and the Mutakallimun, that the mind is in the heart, right? That is really where thinking and consciousness exists. Now, why do they say this? Well, they use some verses of the Qur'an. There are several verses in the Qur'an that indicate this, and they're quite clear. They're not really verses where you can really go around them. I'll give you an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about some people who disbelieve in Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts with which they do not comprehend. This would only make sense if the heart has the ability to comprehend. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about them, that they have hearts with which they do not comprehend. In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. Allah, He says, have they not traveled throughout the earth so that they will have hearts with which they can understand and comprehend? So the hearts have the ability to comprehend, to understand, according to this verse. In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَذِكْرَى لِمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ قَلْبٌ. He says, in that there is a reminder for one who has a heart, an attentive heart, right? So the heart has the ability to benefit from reminders. Now, medically speaking, it may seem like the only function of the heart is that it pumps blood. It's just an organ that pumps blood. Here you have these verses that mention that the heart has cognitive abilities. So this is why this first group of scholars, this is why they say that the mind and consciousness is in the heart. Now, it's actually quite interesting that whenever we speak about certain aspects of consciousness, we refer to the heart. And this is something that is universal, and it's not just found in the Western world, right? So whenever we're talking about love, whenever we're talking about heartbreak and the fact that you got into a divorce or a breakup or something like this, we always refer to the heart. We tell people to follow your heart. So in the lived experience and our language that we use, it reflects a greater role of the heart than just pumping blood. Now, some may say, well, this is not scientific. We're going to get to this, inshallah, right? But this is the view, perhaps you can say, the view of the majority of the scholars on this particular issue, and that is consciousness is in the heart. We do have a second group of scholars, and this view is attributed to the Hanafis as well as the Hanbalis. It's been narrated from Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, where they said that the consciousness of a human being is in the brain. That's the seat of consciousness. That's where your thinking happens. It has nothing to do with the heart. Now, why do they hold this position? Well, they look at the observable evidence, right? So the evidences that these scholars use is that whenever someone is hit in the head or they have some kind of head trauma or they have a head injury, we find that their ability to use their mind is inhibited. So because of this, we can see this very clearly, that the brain has a role. And if the brain has a role, that's where the seat of consciousness is. Now, There is a third view, which it's kind of like a compatibilistic view where we reconcile between both of them, and that is to say that the heart has a role in consciousness and the brain has a role in consciousness as well. But how do we determine exactly what that is? Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he was famous for having this view. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he mentions a narration where Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he was asked, how did you gain this knowledge? And Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, the great companion, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the great scholar of the Qur'an, he says, بِلِسَانٍ سَؤُولٍ وَقَلْبٍ عَقُولٍ. He said, I've gained this knowledge with an inquisitive tongue, right, a questioning tongue, وَقَلْبٍ عَقُولٍ, and a comprehending heart. A heart that has the ability to understand, an understanding heart. So Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he attributes the knowledge that he has, that it came through having an attentive heart, an understanding, comprehending heart. So if you look at the understanding of the companions, we find that they referred to the heart as having the ability to understand as well. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he mentions that, look, the word qalb in the Arabic language could refer to the organ. And there's even a hadith on this as well. There's a hadith reported by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ, he tells us that in the body there is a mudgha, there is a piece of flesh, there's an organ. إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ. If it is sound, the entire body is sound. وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ. And if it's corrupted, the entire body is corrupted. أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبِ. He says, indeed, it is the heart. This refers to an organ. It's a piece of flesh in the body. So the heart is that organ that we have in our bodies. Now, another meaning of a heart, though, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah mentions, is that the word qalb in the Arabic language doesn't necessarily denote an organ, but it can refer to the inside of something. According to this understanding, the qalb would not just include the brain or the heart, but pretty much everything else within the human being, right? It can refer to anything there. And Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he mentions some linguistic examples. He mentions that it is said qalbul hinta, the kernel, the heart, the center of wheat, or also qalbul lawza, the kernel or the center of an almond, for example, right? So this is perhaps a way that someone can reconcile between this, but I think this is a bit of a problem. Why? Because we do have that hadith that mentions what the qalb is in the human being, right? That it's a morsel of flesh, and it reflects the state of the entire body of the human being. If you look at all of this together, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he gives an explanation as to how he reconciles between both of these views. And in his fatwa, he says, وَالتَّحْقِيقُ أَنَّ الرُّوحَ الَّتِي هِيَ النَّفْسِ لَهَا تَعَلُّقٌ بِهَذَا وَهَذَا. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he says that the ruh and the nafs, these are two words which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses to refer to the soul. He tells us that the ruh, which is the nafs, which is the soul, it has a connection with this and that. Meaning it has a connection with the brain and it has a connection with the heart. So the soul works together with these two organs. وَمَا يَتَّصِفُ مِنَ الْعَقْلِ بِهِ يَتَعَلَّقُ بِهَذَا وَهَذَا. And whatever consciousness or comprehension the soul has is connected with the brain and the heart. لكن مبدأ الفكر والنظر في الدماغ ومبدأ الإرادة في القلب. So this part is actually interesting, because when we say that the soul and its cognitive abilities is related to the brain and the heart, then what exactly does the brain and the heart do? He says the seat of reflection and investigation, like logical thinking, procedural thinking, computing things, mathematics, logic, all of these things, this is in the brain. This is in the dimagh. And then he says, وَمَبْدَأَ الْإِرَادَةِ فِي الْقَلْبِ. And the seat or the starting point of desire is in the heart. So this is actually quite interesting, because it does reflect the way that we refer to the heart. And this is something that is used universally across languages around the entire world. Whenever talking about desire, whenever talking about emotion, whenever talking about anger, whenever talking about love and sadness and grief, we always refer to the heart. Naturally, it's almost like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that in our fitrah to refer to the heart using these aspects of cognition and consciousness, right? And whenever talking about mathematics and logic, right, we always refer to the head. In fact, sometimes when you think about things and you try to investigate things, you might even get a headache. right? You feel it in your head. And someone who something happened to their brain and their brain did not develop, we find that they can still have strong emotions towards things, even though their ability to think and comprehend and understand can be very inhibited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best ultimately, but what we can definitely conclude is that based on the verses of the Qur'an, the heart definitely has a role, right? It definitely has a role because of those verses that we've mentioned. Now, is there anything in the medical literature that proves this? Now, generally speaking, this is not accepted. There's something called cellular memory. Okay, cellular memory is the idea that the organs that you have can store memories, right? And that they, you can think with them and all of this kind of stuff, right? This, generally speaking, is considered a myth. This is not accepted. That's not a scientific fact. But there are lots of anecdotal evidence on this. Like, there are tons of people that have gotten heart transplants. Not just heart transplants, but organ transplants, kidney transplants, all sorts of transplants where they now have the feelings and emotions and inclinations of the donors of these organs. That's quite bizarre. There's also something called broken heart syndrome, where someone who goes through an intense emotional experience, they can actually go through what seems to be a heart attack, right? Broken heart syndrome is established. It's where the heart, parts of it can actually become weakened and damaged if someone goes through an intense emotional experience. So can we use this particular condition, the broken heart syndrome, to, kind of relate to what Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said, which seems to be the stronger view, that there is a connection between both? Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. I think the problem with the consciousness is that it is not something that's observable. You can't observe the consciousness, right? And that's what makes it almost impossible to determine with certainty exactly where it is. So that's why it's called the hard problem of consciousness, because it's not really something that's physical. It's not a physical process that we can really observe. So that's the problem. We have a lot of these anecdotal evidences of people having like the memories of their organ donors being transferred to them. There are so many examples of this. There is examples of a murder occurring, and then that person who dies, their heart is transplanted to a recipient, and that organ recipient now has the memories and the recollections of the murder. And you have cases that have led to even arrests, right? Mysteries being solved because of this. But like I said, this is not really something that is accepted in the medical field. You do have neuroscientists, though. You do have some voices that are pushing for this idea that this is actually something real, but there's a big difference of opinion on this. Now, there are many examples of this, but I think the most bizarre example is the example of something that happened to a man by the name Terry Cottle, and his wife's name was Cheryl. In the mid-90s, he actually took his own life. Now, the way that he took his own life is very interesting, because we're going to see that something very similar happens with the heart recipient. When Terry Cottle did this to himself, he died. They took his heart and they transplanted it into the chest of Sonny Graham. Now, he's very grateful for this heart transplant, and he got in contact with the widow of Terry Cottle, Cheryl. And eventually they form a relationship and they fall in love, and eventually they get married. And what is the bizarre detail here is that Sonny Graham then takes his own life in almost the exact same way that Terry Cottle did. Now, what exactly is happening here? Both of them do this to themselves in almost the exact same way. And what's very interesting is that Sonny Graham was asked about his relationship with Cheryl, right, the widow of his heart donor, and he says about her that I felt like I've known her my whole life. So could there be some sort of connection with the heart? Could there be some kind of like desire that he also got from this particular heart? There are so many examples of people getting cravings for foods and for things that they never had before, but then the donor actually had these cravings and desires. There's lots of examples of testimonials of this. So could there be any truth behind this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. I think that it still should remain in the realm of possibility. Why? Because this is truly a modern phenomenon. This is not something that the scholars of the past had access to. This is only the result of modern scientific advancements. So we're going to learn more and more about the human body. The more we learn about the human body, the more we realize that we actually don't know. And the next time someone tries to tell you that the Qur'an is unscientific or the Qur'an says something wrong because it mentions that the heart understands, then you should understand and you should try to convey to this person that where the consciousness of a human being is, where the mind of a human being is actually something that is highly controversial, and there's no evidence that it's in any particular organ or part of the body. And that's why, as we mentioned, philosophically, this is a huge controversy and is called the hard problem of consciousness. And ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.